welcome everyone. Yes, as I'll explain a bit how my session will link to Mike's. Let me just check that I can see the chat. Okay. Yes, what would also be great is if anyone who's doing a podcast could drop into the chat something about their podcast, and also whether or not what I'm saying either connects with what they're talking about or whether or not it's a bit different, and then we can see whether or not what I'm presenting actually is generic experience of podcasting for presentations. So I'll just go back to my presentation. Here we go. Right, so this is me. I'm Senior Learning Designer at Durham, as Anshul's just said. I've been podcasting since March 2019 with Mike, who I think is in the audience. We've done Pedagodzilla between us, and also what I'll be talking about is based on a paper that I wrote with some colleagues, one of whom is Mike, and it's a sort of more generic research talking around 4 different podcasts. I'm also audio-wise, I'm Dr. Rock on the Thursday night show, so if you want to listen to some late night sounds, then tune in on that at some point. Okay, so this is the thing that Mike talked about, and he spoke really in depth about one podcast, which was the Pedagodzilla one, and I'm talking about more generic experiences of from 4 different podcasts that was in the talk paper, the presented paper. So if you like, Mike's thing is a sort of long, narrow, is a very deep, narrow one, and mine's a sort of more generic, broad one. And so there's obviously a little bit in between. So basically what I'm doing is an expanding upon this particular slide. So if you're familiar with that, don't be, it's okay. We are, there'll be a lot of new content in this one. And these are the 4 podcasts that we interviewed for this particular paper. And our first question was why do and the other thing I need to clarify is that this thing was specifically looking at podcasters that produce podcasts for professional development for each other, for other people, because most of us are in professional services in some way or other, but also, or academic development, but also for ourselves. That's one of the things that emerged, was that we found it was actually quite useful for our own professional development. And so these are the main things why people did it. They had work that they wanted to get out to a wider audience. They wanted to learn about one's discipline, our own discipline, more, and Mike went into that in a lot of depth about what he learned about pedagogy from our podcast, but the others were doing it for the same thing, and everybody does it. The copyright people wanted to learn more about copyright, and it was a great way to get to talk to experts in the field of in the field of copyright, to learn more about it, and then almost as a side product, getting out to a wider audience. But in the first instance, it was learning themselves about what was going on. And then also one thing that emerged that everybody had in common was it was a platform or a way to find a space for performance, or for using creativity in a new way. I think all of us, not entirely, but felt slightly thwarted by our jobs, in our abilities to express creativity in a lot of ways. One of the people that we interviewed is from Colombia, and she was talking about the oral tradition from her culture, and that her job didn't really give her many opportunities to dig into that particular culture, and so therefore podcasting was a way of doing that, as a way of telling stories. And then also it was a good way to carve out time. We were competing demands on our time, but to say, look, once a month we're going to get together for an hour and a half or whatever to get together and chat and create a space. One of the podcasters talked about a liminal space, so it's getting to work, but before work started, here was a time they could set aside for doing this sort of activity. So I'm just going to have a look at the chat and see if anything's come up from that that's particularly interesting. Okay, yeah, Rowan's talking about staffs. Yeah, okay. Yes, and I think there's a lot of overlap with some of the other things. And particularly the previous one, which I'll come to, and I'll talk about a little bit about assessment at the end. Let's go back to the okay, so these are some of the tips about getting started. One of the things we all did was actually have a particular angle or a particular hook. So it's copyright, or it's explaining pedagogy theory. It's I've helped out a couple of people at Durham to set up their own podcasts. And the first question is, what is the specific thing that you're looking at? If you wanted to describe what makes yours not necessarily unique, but sets it out a little bit from what everybody else does, what is it? It's not just chatting about education, it's talking about a specific thing. Is it female professors? Is it ethics in research? Is it people's case studies and that sort of stuff? So work out the hook. The most difficult thing, I think, is coming up with a unique name. If most of these things, well, we disseminate them through a podcasting platform, and you don't want your podcast to come up with the same name as a dozen or more others. So obviously, quite a lot, and it's usually the most difficult thing, is coming up with that. Some artwork, or at least use something from Unsplash that actually stands out a bit, because people are scrolling through and looking for a podcast to follow. And if yours looks a bit splashy, that's going to be quite good. The other thing that I think Mike talked about, but all of us did, was do a pilot or two, or in one of the ones I'm working at Durham, 3. Just do a test run. The reason why you'd want to do this is you're never going to show this. This is something where you iron out all of the bugs with the format. You because you'll need a format. I'll come to that in a bit, but it's a good way to make sure that you've got it all worked out. You know what you're doing. What you don't want is for people they've listened to your most recent one. We've done, I think, 50 or 60 now, Mike and I. That we know what we're doing now, on the whole, a lot more than we did when we started. What you don't want people to be doing is listening to the last one and then going back to the first one, and your first one's a bit rubbish, and so they don't want to listen to anymore. So if you go into the first one with a plan that you're never going to release this, iron out all the things, and then do it again in the format that you want. The format is about the structure. And I think structure and informalities are a theme that will come across throughout all of this, is that it can't just be a random waffle through a lot of different things. You'll need to have points at which you think about what you're doing next. You've broken down your overall discussion into different chunks, and so therefore you can go off in a different direction, but it comes to, here's our next question, or here's something, I will introduce this at some point where we'll introduce a quiz, or what do you know about this, or just something to give it some sort of difference throughout the whole thing. So it's basically got it hangs together in a structured way. So the most popular ones are, here's the most my favorite fact from the last 7 days, 4 different people, 4 different facts. Conversation goes off in a different direction and then starts again. Or here's a menu. Menus are brilliant for a structure, because it's like, well, here's your main, here's your starter, here's your mains, poppadom or bread and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so roles. I did a search. The reason for the picture is I did a search on roles, spelt it right on Unsplash, and it came up with this as a picture. Okay, so it's the way me and Mike work, and actually everybody works, is that there's somebody that's holding the structure together, more or less, and somebody that's going off in different directions. And then you include in or bring in somebody who's a specialist on that subject for the episode. It doesn't matter specifically what those roles are, but if you've got different people doing different things, it just seems to work when you're actually bringing it all together. Again, this is something we all did, post-production. I'm editing. I've spent a couple of days editing an episode at the moment because it's all over the place. But this is, I think, one of the things that intimidates people when they're coming in, and new people, is, oh, I don't know what I'm saying. What happens if I go blank? it doesn't matter. You reassure them that actually all of if they can take as long as they want, we're going to cut that out later. If you want another go at saying something, you've waffled on and it doesn't make sense, you can start again and make it say it more concisely. You can say what you like, nothing too self-incriminatory. If you do say something, you can edit it out. If you jump around or if you think of different things to do it, a way to express it, you can actually have a conversation while you're recording to go, well, maybe it worked like this, maybe it worked like that. Everybody does that. That seems to be a generic thing as well. And then it's quite nice to have little bits of music or some sound effects, just a regular thing, so that the transition between the different things work, and you can put those in later. And Descript actually helps with the editing as well, perhaps for a little bit. Once you've done it, these are different ways you can actually try and get it out more. I only got back onto Twitter purely so I could promote the podcast, but it's a great way to get tips from people, engage with listeners, get feedback from them, suggestions for more content. The show notes, so you put the podcast on a website, and then you can put things like, it's partly academic in a way, so you need references, so you will be citing people in your podcast. Where do they go for more information? Put all this onto a website. The other thing that people have said, like, oh, I've only got 110 people this week in the first couple of episodes. Thing is, it builds geometrically. So you get one new person in week 10, they will go back and listen to all of them, hopefully, if they like it. But that means you get 10 more listens. So 20 weeks in, you might have twice the audience. One new person you've added to this will then listen to 20 episodes. You get 20 listens. So each time you get a new episode, you get some new people in, the number of actual downloads across your whole podcast will increase. So the number of so after 4 years, keep at it. That's the main thing. Do it pretty regularly for a couple of years, and you'll get there. You'll get that word out. Okay, and then once you've got that going, this is something we do presentations like today, seminars. You get asked to do seminars, which is nice. Workshops. We've done a series of workshops at the OU and at Durham. It's on our PG Cap. How do you do a podcast? New people setting up them have asked me for help. They asked Mike for help. So you end up kind of engaging more, not just with a community of podcasters, but with people who want to join that community as well. We're working on a book base using the transcripts from the podcast as a starting point. That's nearly ready for publication. It's being edited together at the moment. And then also Mike's produced some badges and there's flyers and all that sort of stuff. So it's a nice way to get the word out. Let's see how we're doing for time. Okay, nearly at the end. Right. Okay. Why though specifically professional development? When we put this paper together, I didn't find a single paper on podcasting for professional development in the literature. There are plenty, huge numbers on using it for teaching, nothing on teaching each other or developing each other. Why is it? Well, obviously, you can listen to it while you're doing the washing up or while you're driving or whatever, so it's accessible. It's cheap. The platforms are all they're all being monetized at the moment, so it's not quite as cheap as it used to be. But the software I use for editing is free. The headphones are fairly cheap. They're £30, £40. You don't need really good ones anyway. It's useful to get a headset. A professional mic really does make a difference. But it's compared to video or other ways to get these sorts of messages out, it's really easy. But the key thing that came out of this was that essentially what makes a podcast, it's a conversation. It has to be relaxed, has to be fun, and it has to have emergent qualities along the way. So we've talked about structure, we've talked about format, but it's also keeping it loose enough that you can have that emergence. And this is a sort of little figure I came up with for the paper, but it's and one of the podcasters said that he came up with this thing from me, this phrase, liberating structures. I have no recollection of coming up with that phrase at all, but he uses it a lot, so now I do. So you've got preparation, you've got the post-production, you've got all the things that are structures, but on the other side, you've got all of the things that give you this permission to play and be playful. And you've got the protection from mistakes from the post-production. You've got this evolving narrative and telling stories and performing. So it's getting that balance right. And what we all found was key was that we were all reflective practitioners. Each time we think what went right, what went wrong, and that is what enabled us to get that balance right. And something I've tagged on to the end of this as a result of something else I've been asked, and I've just got time, is about using it for assessment. And that essential thing about podcasting being dialogic and emergent and about conversations has kind of made me think about the value of it for assessment. And it goes in with what Helena was talking about, which is, the whole encouraging social constructivist stuff amongst your students. A lot of them don't like live presentations, but if you're saying let's do a podcast for assessment, I think if you are going to use podcasting for assessment, you've got to capture the essential element of what podcasting is, and that is the conversational thing. It's a tension between structure and playfulness. And unless you're doing that, you're not really drawing on essentially what a podcast is. So if we're talking about what makes a podcast, it's not that it's audio, it's not that it's transmitted through some sort of a broadcast platform, it's that it's conversation. And that is what the essential element of it is, I would say. And when we're talking about using technology for assessment, we often focus on what is the medium. So podcasting, I've got them all to do, make something, an audio recording, therefore I've got them doing a podcast. But then so often these recordings are just an essay that's read out. And in which case you're not really assessing a different sort of skill because they've written an essay and then you could just get a text-to-speech reader to do it for them. What are you doing that's different? What's the difference there? So it's a superficial difference, I would argue. And if we wanted to do something that is drawing on a different skill set, which is drawing on the ability to students to communicate with another student, to evolve a narrative and think about new ideas as they're presented and as these questions and answers are happening, what we need to do is capture that and assess that and make that the podcast. So this is how I would suggest doing it. You get the students to pair up. You get the student who's being assessed to write questions for the friend to ask them, and then records that conversation that evolves when those questions are asked of them. So this is, I would say, what makes a podcast. Ask me that when we have this chat. Then go into the recordings, get a recorder out, can be on the phone, whatever. And then I get somebody to ask me that, and then I have that chat, and then you get that bouncing back between them. And that then captures the essential nature of podcasts, structured, but free-flowing, emergent, and communicative in a way that other forms of assessment aren't. So, final thing, I've set up, a lot of people want to get into podcasting, but only want to do a one-off podcast, in which case, chat to me. I've got a platform specifically for one-off, or on the whole, three-off, because people like trilogies, podcasts. And so therefore I can put that out on Pedagogy Podium. And there's about 10 on there so far. Not many people are taking me up on the offer. They all want to do it themselves on their own platform. That's fine. But if you wanted to just do a one-off, contact me. I'm on Twitter. I'm also on Blue Sky now. And that's my email address. And finally, just citing who else has been involved in this.